Sarah Marie Johnson. On July 1, 2005, Haley, Idaho, witnessed a high-profile sentencing in a double parricide. Sarah Marie Johnson, 18, received 2 fixed life terms without parole, plus an additional 15 years for a firearm enhancement. But what drove a 16-year-old to end both parents' lives before dawn? Crime timeline. On September 2, 2003, in Bellevue, Idaho, gunshots were fired inside a family home shortly after first light. Investigators placed the window of death between about 6:20 and 7 o'clock that morning. A Winchester Model 70 rifle, chambered in .264, had been taken from a guest house on the property and used at close range. One parent in bed, one in the bathroom. The master bedroom door was found propped open with pillows, a small domestic detail that fixed the scene in time and space for detectives reconstructing movements down the hall. Background snapshot. Johnson was 16 at the time of the killings, living with her parents in a small mountain community. Months of conflict centered on an older boyfriend and strict household rules. Attention noted repeatedly in case filings and media coverage. The relationship and parental efforts to restrict it formed the primary context for the rupture that followed. Investigation and evidence. Patrol officers secured the house and the curbside trash, where they recovered a pink bathrobe stained with the mother's blood and a latex glove containing DNA from both victims and from Johnson. A leather glove with gunshot residue surfaced with the robe. Its mate was later located in Johnson's bedroom. The murder rifle was traced to the guest house tenant, establishing access, while trajectory and tissue findings aligned with close-range discharge in the bedroom and adjacent bath. Together, these items, DNA, residue, and weapon provenance, became the backbone of the state's theory of direct involvement. Charges, court, sentence. Prosecutors charged Johnson as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Venue shifted to Ada County for trial. On March 16, 2005, a jury returned guilty verdicts on both counts. In July of that year, the court imposed 2 fixed life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 15 years for the firearm enhancement. The Idaho Supreme Court affirmed the convictions in June of 2008, and later upheld the denial of a successive post-conviction petition in May of 2017, which had invoked evolving Eighth Amendment limits on juvenile sentencing after Miller and Montgomery. Current status. Johnson remains incarcerated at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center under the fixed life terms, with no parole eligibility under the judgment. Jasmine Richardson. On November 8, 2007, Medicine Hat, Alberta, witnessed a youth sentence under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act. Jasmine Richardson, 14, at sentencing, received the statutory maximum, a 10-year youth disposition, for 3 counts of first-degree murder. But how does a 12-year-old become central to a triple homicide inside her own home? Crime timeline. On April 23, 2006, a child's playdate became the trigger for discovery. Around 1 in the afternoon, 3 family members were found dead inside a suburban house. The 12-year-old daughter was missing. Investigators quickly located her the next day in Leader, Saskatchewan, after linking the case to online activity and a stick figure drawing recovered at school that depicted the family's killing. The window between a normal morning and an irreversible outcome narrowed to a few unobserved hours. Background snapshot. Richardson was 12. In the months before the murders, she began a clandestine relationship with a 23-year-old man. Family efforts to restrict contact escalated conflict at home. Online posts and messages painted a fantasy of escape that hardened into planning. Investigation and evidence. Detectives built the case through digital traces and peers' statements. social network messages that discussed getting rid of parental control, a drawing at school that mapped violence in the home, and financial and movement breadcrumbs, including a late-day ride arranged after the killings. Arrests followed in a neighboring province less than 24 hours after discovery. Charges, court, sentence. Because she was under 14 at the time of the offense, Richardson could not be sentenced as an adult. A judge found her guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder on July 9, 2007, and on November 8 imposed the maximum youth sentence, 10 years, structured as time already served in custody, followed by psychiatric hospitalization and community supervision with strict conditions. Current status. Richardson completed the disposition on May 6, 2016, ending court-ordered conditions and supervision. Tyler Witt. On August 12, 2011, Placerville, California, witnessed simultaneous sentencings in a case that began with a missing-from-work check and ended in a bedroom homicide. Tyler Witt, 14 at the time of the killing, received 15 years to life for second-degree murder in the death of her mother, Joanne Witt. But what drove a freshman's infatuation to cross from secrecy into lethal planning? Crime timeline. The homicide occurred overnight on June 11, 2009, inside a home in El Dorado Hills. When the victim failed to report to work, deputies conducted a welfare check and found her stabbed in bed. Within days, Witt and her 19-year-old boyfriend were located and arrested at a shopping center on the San Francisco Peninsula. Search efforts documented attempts to flee and evidence of a failed suicide pact. Background snapshot. Witt, 14, had begun a relationship with an older partner who occasionally stayed in the family home. Discovery of a journal prompted the mother to contact law enforcement about unlawful sexual activity, inflaming tensions. Friends described a spiral of melodramatic plans framed as run away or end it, overlaying a routine of school, a local coffee shop, and late-night messages. Investigation and evidence. Key items included the journal turned over to authorities before the crime, scene work, noting elevated air conditioning settings, and a victim found beneath bed covers, and forensic findings including male DNA under the victim's nails consistent with a struggle. Surveillance and witness accounts tracked the pair across the Bay Area until arrest. These strands, together with post-offense statements, established a joint plan to neutralize the mother before leaving town. Charges, court, sentence. Prosecutors charged Witt as a juvenile transferred to adult court. She accepted a plea to second-degree murder and received 15 years to life. Her boyfriend was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances and sentenced to life without parole. Current status. The parole board granted Witt parole on August 26, 2022. She was released the following year to parole supervision. Pauline Parker. On August 28, 1954, Christchurch, New Zealand, heard 2 verdicts that crystallized a case already roiling public debate. Pauline Parker, 16, and Juliet Hume, 15, were convicted of murdering Parker's mother and ordered detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. But how does an afternoon walk from a tea kiosk end with a parent dead in a city park? Crime timeline. On June 22, 1954, after tea in Victoria Park, the trio walked along a wooded path. Minutes later, the mother lay fatally bludgeoned. The teenagers ran for help, claiming an accidental fall. The story unraveled at once. Police found the weapon, a half-brick inside a stocking, in nearby brush, and the injuries were unmistakably homicidal. The missing time between leaving the kiosk and calling for help was measured not in hours, but in the short distance down the path. Background snapshot. Parker and Hume were bright and intense, bound by a private fantasy world. family disruption loomed. Hume's parents were separating, and a move abroad was planned. Parker believed her mother would block any joint relocation. The perceived obstacle became the target: investigation and evidence. Beyond the recovered weapon and the pattern of head injuries, diaries and writings documented fixation and plans to remove the barrier to the girls remaining together. Witnesses from the tea kiosk anchored the timeline. The physical path length and blood distribution contradicted any fall narrative. Charges, court, sentence. Tried as juveniles in an adult court, both were convicted of murder. Because of their ages, they were spared capital punishment and ordered detained at the government's pleasure, a form of indeterminate youth custody. Each ultimately served about 5 years before release, with post-release conditions limiting contact. Current status. After release, Parker lived under a new identity in England and kept a low profile. Hume, under the name Anne Perry, later became a crime novelist. The case remains a national touchstone in New Zealand criminological history. Aaron Caffey. On January 3, 2009, Emory, Texas, recorded a plea that closed a widely watched parricide. Aaron Caffey, 17 at sentencing, accepted 2 life terms plus an additional 25 years for capital murder tied to the deaths of her mother and 2 younger brothers. By statute and plea math, public reports place her parole eligibility near age 59. But what drove a 16-year-old to plan a home attack that left one parent alive to crawl from a burning house? Crime timeline. In the early hours of March 1, 2008, in Alba, Texas, a fire consumed a family home after gunshots and stabbings inside. The father escaped despite multiple wounds. The mother and 2 sons were found deceased. Within days, investigators tied the scene to the daughter's boyfriend and his friend, while a 4th participant acted as driver. Planning threads. Warnings about forbidden dating, talk of leaving home, narrowed the window from teenage conflict to premeditated assault. Background snapshot. Caffey was 16, a small-town student in a guarded relationship with an older boyfriend her parents opposed. Friends and records referenced mounting defiance, late-night messages, and talk of removing obstacles. The father's survival and statements anchored familial dynamics and timeline reconstruction. Investigation and evidence. Fire scene recovery documented accelerant patterns and ballistic traces amid extensive burn damage. Phone activity and witness accounts placed the 2 male assailants at the house, with the driver positioned nearby. Interviews and plea filings mapped roles. The boyfriend and his friend entered the home. The driver waited off the road. The daughter's coordination and post-offense movements completed the chain. Charges, court, sentence. Charged with capital murder and certified to adult court, Caffey took a plea in Hopkins County. The court imposed 2 life sentences plus 25 years. Contemporary reporting and later summaries note parole eligibility governed by Texas law for juveniles sentenced in adult court, generally after 40 years in capital cases, with case coverage specifying an age 59 eligibility estimate under her stacked terms. Co-defendants received life without parole or lengthy terms. Current status. Caffey remains incarcerated within the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Public inmate records list her as in custody. Sandra Anderson, alias The Bathtub. Girls Case. On June 30, 2006, Brampton, Ontario, issued youth sentences that capped a matricide first labeled an accident. Under a publication ban, the elder sister, widely referenced by the alias Sandra Anderson, received the Youth Criminal Justice Act maximum of 10 years, structured as 6 years in custody and 4 under community supervision, after a first-degree murder conviction. But how does an apparent bathtub mishap evolve into a homicide case reopened nearly a year later by a wired confession? Crime Timeline. On January 18, 2003, Mississauga paramedics responded to a home where a mother was found unresponsive in a bath. Initial findings leaned accidental, citing alcohol and codeine. 11 months later, a teenage acquaintance approached police. Equipped with covert audio and video, he recorded incriminating admissions that reset the case from accident to planned drowning. Arrests followed in January of the next year. Trial began late 2005. Background snapshot. The sisters were mid-teens. Household strain included alcohol misuse and financial stressors. Digital searches and chats later showed method scouting, talk of insurance money, and efforts to stage a believable accident. The aliases Sandra and Beth entered public discourse through a journalist's account, while legal names remained sealed. Investigation and evidence. The reopened probe pivoted on recordings from the wired friend, recovery of chat logs, and a home computer's query history about alcohol, Tylenol 3, and drowning. Toxicology from the original autopsy, high blood alcohol with codeine, was recast as facilitation rather than mere circumstance. The scene's simplicity became probative when paired with pre-offense planning and post-event alibi steps. Charges, court, sentence. Tried as youths, both sisters were convicted of first-degree murder. The court imposed the YCJA ceiling, 10 years total, apportioned between custody and community supervision. Adult sentencing was unavailable due to age. Appeal efforts later focused on collateral participants, not the sisters' core verdicts. Current status. Both sisters completed their sentences and live under protected identities. Later reporting has described low-profile professional lives consistent with the publication band's goals. Sierra Halseth. On October 20, 2022, Las Vegas, Nevada, witnessed twin life sentences with parole eligibility after 22 years. Sierra Halseth, 16 at the time of the offense, received life with the possibility of parole after pleading guilty alongside her boyfriend to murdering her father and related offenses. But what drove a forbidden relationship to escalate into a planned patricide inside a suburban home? Crime Timeline. In early April of 2021, relatives and a landlord requested a welfare check at a Northwest Valley residence. Inside the garage, responders discovered the victim's burned body. Fire damage extended to nearby items and vehicle space. Investigators quickly fixed the core window to the prior day and night, when neighbors had heard disturbances and seen smoke. The homicide was followed by arson and a short flight across state lines. Authorities located the teenage daughter and her boyfriend in Salt Lake City days later, using purchase trails and surveillance that documented travel and the use of the victim's cards. The rapid reconstruction, body recovery, credit card activity, interstate movement, compressed the mystery into a narrow band of hours. Background snapshot. Halseth was 16. Family conflict centered on a relationship parents had attempted to block months earlier after learning of plans to run away. Custody filings and household tensions formed the domestic backdrop, with the father attempting to reassert boundaries shortly before the homicide. Investigation and evidence. Detectives assembled overlapping proofs, a burned scene in the garage suggesting post-homicide concealment, retail and ATM video tying the pair to the victim's financial accounts, cell phone and travel records charting their route north, and later, a hotel room video in which the teens casually referenced the killing, a piece of digital behavior that undercut any claim of panic. The evidentiary spine, a body recovered in an arson-damaged space, electronic spending in the victim's name, and admitted presence. supported charging decisions before negotiations, charges, court, sentence. Both defendants pleaded guilty to multiple counts, including open murder with a deadly weapon, arson, robbery, and fraudulent use of a credit or debit card. On October 20, 2022, the court imposed life terms with the possibility of parole after at least 22 years. The plea resolved capital exposure for the adult co-defendant and set identical parole floors for both, reflecting Nevada's framework for negotiated life sentences on murder charges. Current status: Halseth remains in Nevada Department of Corrections custody, serving life with parole eligibility after the 22-year minimum. Kim Edwards, the Spalding case. On November 10, 2016, Nottingham, England, recorded indeterminate youth sentences with long minimum terms in a double homicide that began in a quiet Lincolnshire semi-detached. Kim Edwards, 14 at the time of the killings, was ordered detained for life with a minimum term initially set at 20 years, later reduced on appeal to 17.5 years. But how does a teenage plan to remove a household problem evolve into a coordinated night attack that leaves a mother dead in her own bed? Crime timeline. In April of 2016, Edwards' boyfriend entered the family home at night via a bathroom window after a prearranged signal. The pair had earlier barricaded themselves together and run away before being returned. Within days, the planning hardened. While the victim slept, the boy carried out the stabbings and smothering. The daughter remained the inside facilitator and post-incident organizer. The teens stayed in the house afterward, drawing curtains and remaining indoors until absence reports and routine checks brought police to the address. Discovery of both bodies ended a short, sealed window in which everyday, quiet, masked, completed homicide. Background snapshot. Edwards was 14. Case records describe a combustible bond with her boyfriend and mounting resentment toward her mother and younger sister. School difficulties, prior absconding, and deepening isolation marked the months before the attack. The relational intensity, rather than any single acute event, framed the path to planning. Investigation and evidence. The case turned on a clean physical scene and extensive admissions. Officers recovered the kitchen knife used in the attacks, blood distribution consistent with sleeping victims, and the route of entry through the bathroom. Diaries, statements, and later police interview recordings documented intent and roles. The timeline was anchored by neighborhood observations and the absence of forced entry beyond the window route. Together with cell site and routine call records, the prosecution charted a continuous sequence from planning to execution to days of concealment. Charges, court, sentence. Tried at Nottingham Crown Court, the boyfriend pleaded guilty to murder. Edwards contested liability, advancing diminished responsibility, and was convicted. In November of 2016, the court imposed detention for life with a 20-year minimum term. On June 9, 2017, the Court of Appeal reduced both minimum terms to 17.5 years, citing youth and other factors while leaving the life orders intact. Reporting restrictions on naming the pair were lifted as part of the appellate rulings. Current status. Edwards remains in custody, serving the reduced minimum term before parole consideration. No official release notices have superseded the appellate order's minimum term framework.